Sunday, we looked at how the first few months of the church's, the existence of the church of Jesus Christ was described there in Acts 2, the tail end of that chapter. And if you read it, if you look at Acts 2:42 and the next few verses, it sounds great. There was an extended period of what I think would probably be the best experiences that anyone has ever had with fellow Jesus followers. However, if you read a little bit further in the book of Acts, you know that this honeymoon period for the early church didn't really last. It wasn't long before jealousy set in. Some people Barnabas was getting praise, and one couple was jealous of him, and that resulted in some harsh church discipline, if you know anything about the story of Ananias and Sapphira. And then they continue to experience other growing pains in the early church. For example, some people in the church pointed out that it looked like the widows who were culturally more, they called them Greek, meaning that they probably spoke Greek as their first language. Their family wasn't from from Israel, but they were relatively recent immigrants. They said those widows are not receiving help as consistently as were the widows who were Aramaic speaking and more culturally Hebrew. The widows in that time and place, in that day in society there, were often living on the edge, meaning survival-wise. They were relying oftentimes on family and friends for basic needs like food. Women didn't typically inherit, and so if a woman was widowed, then she could really be up a creek without a paddle, as it were. Well, the church had accepted this concern as something that they could help with, but as in so many places, there were those whose families who had been here forever, and those who weren't from around here. I'm one of those who've only been here 3 months now. But, maybe they had just moved to Jerusalem within even maybe a generation or two, but they were still viewed as outsiders by some. In a tight-knit community, it can take quite a while before you're no longer new to the area. And the perception that they had in the early church was that those who hadn't lived in town forever weren't being as treated as well as the widows of the good old boys, So the early church, they had a congregational meeting. Remember, they had the 11 apostles with them there. And they let everyone air their grievances. And then the 11 apostles admitted that this was a valid concern. This is something we want to watch and keep an eye on. But they didn't think it was the best use of their time to run the church's Meals on Wheels program. So they said, let's appoint some deacons, a word which means servant and helper or minister. And let's put them in charge of making sure that all the widows receive the food that they need to survive. And everybody liked this idea, so they selected 7 guys who were well respected and solid in their faith. Among these 7 was a fellow named Stephen. And we don't know much about Stephen. We don't know where he was from, for example, or what he did for a living, or if he had family in the area. But Luke tells us in Acts 6 that he was a man full of God's grace and power, and that he performed amazing miracles and signs among the people of the early church. Some men from a particular synagogue, and this is the Jewish congregation, they still have synagogues today. They meet on the Sabbath, and they worship, and they pray, and they learn together. Some men from one specific synagogue, they took issue with Stephen's work and with his message. They were antagonistic towards the message of Christ. And Luke says they couldn't defeat him in an open debate. When they would stand out in the public forums and argue these things, they couldn't get the best of him. So they got some people to lie about him, about what he was teaching. They had him arrested. They had him brought before the city council in Jerusalem, specifically saying that he was talking trash about the temple as well as the law of Moses. Now, these were the 2 of the most highly regarded things in that culture, and these charges were calculated to get everyone all riled up. And then the city council, it's called the Sanhedrin. You sometimes read about it in the Gospels. It was the supreme religious and legal body of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. There was no higher court there that they could go to other than the Romans in some cases. But the Sanhedrin got Stephen there, and they gave him a chance to answer the charges. And Stephen answers not with a denial like I would. He didn't say, Your Honor, those guys are filthy liars. He answers this with this long, off-the-cuff sermon. And like so many of the early church founders did, he uses it to recount pretty much all of Jewish history up to that time. It's a long passage, and it could be that we even have a condensed version of it here in Acts chapter 7. But let me just summarize it and tell you that his point is that God was not and is not confined to a specific place or even a specific method of interacting with his people. Stephen talks about how God had worked through Abraham, through Joseph, through Moses, through the tabernacle, which is had the temple artifacts that they would carried around from place to place in the wilderness. And later, in the temple that they built in Jerusalem, God did work through those things. And how he had often sent his messengers, the Old Testament prophets, to instruct and to warn his children, the Israelites. But those people were consistently ignored, often persecuted, and sometimes even killed. And he really just lays into them, asserting that they had treated Jesus the same way that they had the prophets of old, ignoring the message of God and killing the messenger. And finally, we get to today's text, which is the conclusion of Stephen's message, just the last part of it, and a description of the aftermath after his closing statement there and what was his trial. So Acts chapter 7, starting at verse 55, I'm going to read here just a few verses. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, gazed steadily into heaven and saw the glory of God. And he saw Jesus standing in the place of honor at God's right hand. And he told them, "Look, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing in the place of honor at God's right hand." Then they put their hands over their ears and they began shouting. They rushed at him and dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. His accusers took off their coats and laid them at the feet of a young man named Saul. As they stoned him, Stephen prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." He fell to his knees, shouting, "Lord, don't charge them with this sin." And with that, he died. Pam and I knew a fellow in Cambodia. Well, we technically still know him, but we haven't seen him since we moved, and he moved out of Cambodia just before we did. But we shared, he was a British fellow named Simon. We shared a language tutor. And we got to know him during a weekly conversation class that we hosted in our apartment there in Phnom Penh. And Simon is a fellow who's completely and totally secular, I guess. He claims to be entirely non-religious and even non-spiritual. One time in a conversation about religion, because this class was a conversational class, so we would just talk about topics, but we did it all in the Cambodian language, in Khmer. But Simon said that that sometimes when he was growing up, he would go to church when he was at school or being forced to go, I guess, by his parents. And even though he had been to the Church of England, some growing up, he had always thought of the Bible as just a book consisting of stories. He said, "To me, they're just stories." And nothing more than stories, he thought, nothing that speaks to deeper truths or something to quench the soul's desire to know God or anything. To him, the Bible is merely a collection of stories. Maybe some of them are true, maybe some are not. And he wasn't trying to offend us or anything like that. He was just telling his viewpoint, which was, of course, just fine. Now, you can read these stories, like this one I just read about Stephen and his lynching. You can see it simply as a story. You can say, well, it's a true story. A story that details the injustice that killed one of the first generation of Christians almost 2,000 years ago. And you go, okay, that happened. It shouldn't have, and it was sad, but that was a long time ago. And it's not like I'm going to face anything like that in my life. What are the chances? And then we read that and we go, okay, so moving on, what's next? But if we just read this story, we shake our heads in pity and empathy, and then we forget about it, we're missing some things here. It's more than just a story or even simply a cautionary tale about upsetting people who are in power. First of all, I want us to think a little bit about the bad guys in this story. These religious leaders who acted like a child might when their parent tells them something they don't want to hear. La, 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 I can't hear you. That's what they were doing, shouting. They were just, we can't hear any more of this. And did you notice the introduction of the Apostle Paul here in this story? His given name is Saul, but after his conversion, he went by Paul. And here, he's on the side of the villains. He's acting as kind of the coat check boy for the crowd that's doing the stoning there. So here's my question about these guys, the bad guys. Do we think that these men and I can guarantee you that they were all men, do we think that they were people who woke up every day, and as they were shaving or whatever, looked in the mirror and thought, well, I might have to kill somebody today. It's early. I don't know yet. Too early to tell. But it's not out of the realm of possibility. I mean, were they examples of the worst sort of people? People who ignored common decency, who were needlessly and casually cruel, who mistreated their wives and beat their servants and yelled at their children constantly. Now, I bet you that very few of them were these types of men. They were leaders in their community. They were religious scholars. They were people, and people looked up to them. We're used to thinking of the Pharisees and the Sadducees as being the bad guys when we read about how they opposed Jesus in the Gospels at every turn. Jesus was doing this, and they said, you can't do that, it's a Sabbath. Or Jesus was teaching this, they said, you can't teach that, that's not what the law of Moses said. We think they were the bad guys. But to people there and then, in that culture, in that society, at that time, they were good men. They were solid. They were upright. They were righteous men. God blessed them with wisdom and usually with wealth. And a man was thought of, he could do worse in his life than to emulate them with his life. And if your daughter got to marry a Pharisee, then that was a good thing, not a bad thing. However, that day, their sense of righteousness led to them committing an act of incredible cruelty. The Romans let most people groups in the empire, they would conquer a country or section there, and they let them handle their own justice systems. But they did stipulate that, you can punish people however you want to for stealing and whatnot. But if it was a capital crime, if someone needed to be executed, then the Romans, they needed to review those cases and hold a trial. Then they would be the ones who would be doing the executing. That's why Jesus had to go before Pilate before he could be crucified, and why the Romans did the actual crucifixion. But that day, these men were so incensed at Stephen that they took matters into their own hands. It was a lynching, not any kind of a legal process. There's a 20-year-old sketch from a British comedy show, which I never knew about it, but recently, in the last few years, it's become kind of a popular internet meme. And in the sketch, 2 Nazi soldiers are at the front during World War II, the Eastern Front. They're waiting for the Russians to attack. And one of them, who goes by Franz in this little sketch, it's just a 3-4 minute sketch or something like that, he discusses something that's been bothering him. So he says to his colleague there, Hans, he says, have you looked at our caps recently? They've got skulls on them. Because the SS uniforms had the Totenkopf, the death's head skull on it right there. Have you looked at our caps? They've got skulls on them. Have you noticed that our caps actually have actually got little pictures of skulls on them? And Hans, he tries to justify it, and by suggesting that they were the skulls of our enemies, or maybe it's more of a pirate skull or something like that, and not a death's head. And Franz remains unconvinced, leading to the line that's the meme you'll see. He says, Hans, are we the baddies? Are we the bad guys here, These men who killed Stephen were full of rage. And afterwards, I am sure that most of them would have justified this criminal act by asserting that they were standing up for what was right. They were standing up for their God. They were delivering justice to an obvious baddie, But they refused to ask the question of whether they themselves were indeed the real baddies in this instance. Christians are not immune to the temptation to see those that we disagree with as the enemy, or even to see people from different countries and different cultures as people that we need to protect our way of life from. We can't let them change how we have it here. Now, it's not the main point of this story for sure, but it is one of several examples that's found in the Bible of people who were filled with what they believed was righteous anger, who failed to stop and ask themselves, are we the baddies, And then they went on to go and do the exact opposite of the godly, Christ-like thing. This country is a lot more, we'll call it secular, than it was when I was growing up. More and more people are likely to view the Bible as just a book of stories, like our friend Simon. And this is something that, we wish wasn't the case for good reasons. But it seems like this societal change has resulted in many Christians adopting kind of an us versus them kind of mindset, treating it like it's some kind of a culture war that we just have to win, that what's at stake is our very lives, instead of seeing it as an opportunity to show Christ's love and how that contrasts with the way that the world actually works. Sometimes, we can stand for the right thing, but we can do it in a completely wrong way. When we're all wound up and feel as though we're full of a divine sense of justice and righteous anger, it's almost certainly a good thing for us to stop and take a minute or two and ask ourselves some difficult questions before we then presume to act on God's behalf. Okay, as I said, that's not the main thrust of this story. Mainly it's about Stephen and how he handled himself in this unimaginably difficult situation. One scholar I read pointed out that this story really challenges us to think about what it means to trust God in the face of things that we cannot control. We can sit here in church and we can score our faith and our trust in God as being pretty high, It's a beautiful day. Other people are out camping and doing fun stuff. We're here in church, That means we're pretty good people, right? Okay, I would buy that. But, we have to ask ourselves, what does a strong faith look like in the worst moments of a person's life? I went down a rabbit hole a little bit this past week on this subject, and I read about what our Christian brothers and sisters are facing in the African country of Nigeria. Since 2009, many thousands of actual church buildings have been destroyed there. They burned them down. And what's worse than that is that just last year alone, in 2025 alone, they figure over 7,000 Christians were killed by, Islamic radicals, tribal militants, or just plain bandits. Some parts of that country are just pretty well lawless. And this is according to some credible sources. This is not the people that are way out there on the fringe. And I always think about this kind of persecution whenever somebody here in the U.S. claims that they're being persecuted for their faith or because of their faith. Having our faith challenged by people, or people asking us hard questions about our faith, does not mean that we are being persecuted. It's just not likely that any of us will face the kind of violence that Stephen did, thankfully. Violence that so many other believers are facing in other parts of this world today. But what does our faith look like when our lives fall apart in other ways? Last Sunday I told you about a friend of mine whose wife recently died, not long after being diagnosed with cancer. Something like that can really be a real challenge to our faith and to our trust in God. And it's not just cancer, but a whole host of other illnesses or syndromes or conditions or accidents that can be quite challenging to us. But there are things in this life that are just as difficult, but in a different way. A year or two ago, I realized I hadn't communicated with an old friend for quite a while. So I sent him a message. And he was living in Idaho. Lives in Idaho. We were still in Cambodia at the time. I gave him a little update about what we were doing in Cambodia. I asked him, I said, John, what's up with you? What's going on in your life these days? And he said, you're going to be sorry you asked. And he proceeded to tell me that the big thing was that his 40-year marriage had dissolved. Nobody had an affair. Nobody did anything terrible or unforgivable. Not the usual things that lead to this. But one day, his wife just told him that she wasn't happy. And the thing that she thought might change that, or at least start in that direction, was getting a divorce from her husband. 4 decades together. 5 kids together. Several grandchildren. The whole of their adult lives spent together as a team. And it's just gone. Now, I've only heard his side of the story, but, he didn't make her out to be the bad guy. He didn't blame her. And it's not my place to assign blame or guilt, so I'm not meaning to do anything like that. But still, I just cannot really imagine going through something like that and coming out being anything like okay on the other side. His world just kind of blew up in his face, or maybe imploded is a better way to describe it. And yet, he's coping. He doesn't sound bitter, and his faith is still alive. It's still there. Last month he told me that he's currently living on a cattle ranch in southern Idaho. And, he guards the cattle. They've got problems with mountain lions and and coyotes and whatnot out there where he's at. And he told me, that most weeks he attends a church that he's the only non-Hispanic person. And I think he said he was the only white guy. But he said most of the songs are sung in Spanish, and he listens to the sermon through an interpreter. Now, granted, he wasn't stoned by an angry mob, but I cannot imagine really how much his faith has been challenged in all this through what he went through. Guy's 62, 64 years old, something like that, and to have to start over and do that at that age. I'm almost that age, and it doesn't sound like anything I want to go through. In the face of an angry crowd, Stephen spoke God's truth to power. And as they were murdering him by throwing rocks at him with all their might, he asked God to not hold his murder against them. It's amazing to me that not only did he preach a very convicting message to them, probably knowing that it could very easily go badly for him, but that his last words were a prayer of forgiveness for his murderers. Like I said, the chance of any of us ever facing a violent death for our faith are probably very, very small, close to zero. But things do happen in our lives that can put our faith to the test. And sometimes people will hurt us so much that the very last thing we want to do is to forgive them. So it's almost certainly a good thing to be encouraged by Stephen's faith and challenged by his amazing ability to forgive. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we ask you would give each of us the power of your Spirit within us to be able to forgive those who hurt us on purpose, but especially those who hurt us without meaning to, those who don't know the effect their words, their actions have on us. Help us to be gracious to them. Help us to have soft hearts that are quick and ready to forgive. We thank you for the example of Stephen and others in your word, and for the example of your Son who forgave his murderers while he hung on the cross. Strengthen our faith, Father. Help us to know that you are with us, that your Spirit is in us and upon us and among us, that we may love you in the good times and the bad, whether things are going our way or whether we're going through a very difficult time at this point. These things we ask in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.